this sermon by saying, if you came here expecting answers to the origin of God, you may be disappointed. This sermon asks far more questions than it ever answers. Every morning as I drop my daughter off for kindergarten, we share this exchange. "What do you want me to be today, Mama?" she asks with a knowing smile on her face. Playing along, I say, I don't know. What do you want to be today? She very proudly answers with the mantra that we developed together. Kind, curious, and brave. And what does it mean to be kind? To treat others and myself with respect. And what do you think it means to be curious? To ask as many questions as I can think of. And brave, to take chances and not be afraid to be wrong. Sometimes she'll accidentally substitute the word curious for the word smart. And I'll have to remind her that the way to becoming smart is by being curious. As Unitarian Universalists, we have dedicated ourselves to being kind, curious, and brave. Today, let's concentrate on the curious part. We like to ask questions. Does anybody agree with that? We really like our questions. Stemming from both our Universalist side, which dared to ask important questions like, how encompassing is God's love truly? And who is worthy of it? Spoiler alert, everyone. And our Unitarian side, which encouraged believers to use their God-given reason to make sense of things for themselves. We are nothing if not a faith built upon inquiries. We believe it aids in our continued spiritual and moral growth, and a faith that doesn't shy away from questions or pretend that they always have the answers is a faith that encourages humility. That same humility allows us to be curious about others, about ourselves, and about our world. This is in part why we are able to be different in belief, but still part of the same community. Why we make good peacemakers, human rights activists, and community organizers. We appreciate the differences and seek ways to come together. In this community, right here, some of you believe firmly that there is a God and use that word to describe it. And some of you may call that God Mother Nature, transcendent love, great wonder, or creator. Some of you feel the only thing you can be certain of in this life is uncertainty, and as such might define yourselves as agnostic, preferring to remain open to the mystery rather than be forced to choose a side. And some of you are as sure as you can be that there is no such thing as a God. Many of you may cringe at the idea of me saying God from the pulpit, while others of you yearn to hear it more often. And the rest of you, well, you're just here for the cookies and coffee. But seriously, how beautiful it is that we are in community with one another, that we listen as much and hopefully more often than we speak, that we seek to nurture one another's growth rather than to dismiss it, that our beliefs can be challenged without it affecting our ego. Now that last one, that's a toughie, right? Steven Pinker, a rather famous cognitive psychologist and author, wrote, "Challenge a person's beliefs and you challenge his dignity, standing, and power. And when those beliefs are based on nothing but faith, they are chronically fragile." Is that true for you, youth? I hope not here, not in this place. But just in case, let's sit our egos aside and dig into the question at hand. I think it an apt place to start by defining what we mean when we say the word God. Now, there are as many ways to interpret God as there are names for it. It might be stretching a little to assume we can both define God and discover her origins in the same sermon, but I'll give it a go. I suppose if I had to pick a definition for the sole purpose of getting us through the service alive, it would be in the traditional, conservative religious sense of the term. An entity that is all-knowing, all-loving, and all-powerful. The God of Scripture, the intimate and involved deity. Of course, problems galore with this definition are several years' worth of sermons in and of itself. But overall, I think it may be more relevant to discuss the origin of the idea of God rather than God itself. So where did this idea of God arise from? Let's take a look at the question from a scientific, philosophical, psychological, and a religious lens. Maybe not in that order. The question of God's origin is a major objection that atheists put forward to justify their disbelief. Bertrand Russell, a well-known British philosopher, in his influential essay entitled "Why I Am Not a Christian," put this forward as his first objection. It's been summarized more recently saying, "The great argument for God was that there had to be a creation, a beginning. But my objection was simple. If God was the beginning, who began God?" Now, one answer to this question is to reimagine our understanding of time and creation. Stephen Hawking wrote, "The role played by time at the beginning of the universe is, I believe, the final key to removing the need for a grand designer and revealing how the universe created itself. The time itself must come to a stop. You can't get to a time before the Big Bang because there was no time before the Big Bang. We finally found something that does not have a cause because there was no time for a cause to exist in. For me, this means there is no possibility of a creator because there is no time for a creator to have existed. Since time itself began at the moment of the Big Bang, it was an event that could not have been caused or created by anyone or anything. So when people ask me if a God created the universe, I tell them the question itself makes no sense. Time didn't exist before the Big Bang, so there is no time for God to make the universe in. It's like asking for directions to the edge of the earth. The earth is a sphere. It does not have an edge, so looking for it is a futile exercise. If there was no time for God to be creator of the universe and time, then God must be created afterwards, in his opinion, either by some great intricate mystical explanation that we remain ignorant of as of yet, or by humanity. And if we're to choose between the two, some of you might side with the theory of Occam's razor. The simplest answer is typically the correct one. And this could provide us with at least one solution. Dean Hammer, a geneticist and author of the book The God Gene, How Faith is Hardwired into Our Genes, proposes that it was evolutionarily beneficial to humanity to believe in God. He believes that a particular gene we carry predisposes us towards mystical or spiritual experiences. In turn, these experiences create an innate sense of optimism and connection to the universe that was beneficial to humanity's continued well-being. The biologist and anthropologist D.S. Wilson supports this theory in his own work, stating that at the level of society, or at least the groups of human beings that existed in the evolutionary past, religious belief promotes cooperation, mutual respect, and solidarity, and these features help the group to survive. One might propose that a God placed this gene, or this evolutionary device, into her own grand design, or equally as viable an answer, that it evolved naturally. Either way you look, you have a scientific answer to who created God. Deep breath. That was heavy, right? That's a lot of science for me. Philosophically, the answer to who created God is not so straightforward. God is frequently referred to as the uncaused cause. But, as I read, if everything in the universe has a cause, why does God get a free pass? Don't we need an explanation of her origin as well? I think the answer to that question is deeply embedded in your opinion of another question. What is the purpose of God? And here is where we get really existential. If God is real, does purpose matter, or is God above purpose? And if she is above it, is it because she is the actual creator of purpose? And in this role, in and of itself, the purpose of God, to give purpose? Did we create God so that we could find purpose? Or did God create her own purpose by creating us? This is why so many people are agnostic. Friedrich Nietzsche was more clear in his opinions of God, stating, "All gods are no more than reflections of what people value." We project our values onto the world, but claim that our interpretation of the world is objective. The idea of a God that embodies these values is part of this projection. God is a personification and objectification of what we value. So philosophically, as you can guess, we can talk ourselves in circles trying to answer the question and come back at the very beginning. So I'll call this a draw. And what of psychology? What does psychology have to bring to the origin of God? Well, it turns out a lot. During my senior year in college, I took a class with our university chaplain, Reverend Dr. Diane Mowry, a Presbyterian minister. It was just she and I, and we had grown to know one another for over my 4 years studying religion in undergrad. But don't feel too bad for her being one-on-one with me, because my college's small class sizes, she knew very well what she was getting into, sitting with me each week. She understood that if there was a debate to be had, myself and one friend who only wore tie-dye and whose voice was an exact replica of Matthew McConaughey's, if you can imagine, like Surfer from the backwoods of Tennessee. We were sure to be the devil's advocates. In our small group of philosophy and religion majors, we were those darned atheists ruining everyone else's fun. And dear Dr. Mowry, knowing all of this, agreed to mentor me through an independent study course on atheism through the ages. As it turned out, we mostly just read Freud. It may be low-hanging fruit, but his works on religion, while certainly from their time, as one says, chock full of sexism with a healthy dose of pejorative language thrown in for good measure, they were, for all their faults, also insightful and seemed to speak to a primal knowledge of ourselves. When I read it, it affected me deeply. And this makes sense because Freud was more fascinated by humanity's desire for belief than he was with belief itself. He wants to know, why does one believe? From what part of humanity's beginnings did belief in God arise? What does this belief create in us or destroy in us? And what would a world without belief in a God really be like? Freud was an atheist, and in his writings on the topic of religion, his personal beliefs about God often clouded his objectivity. While his beliefs about religion evolved as he aged, he initially believed that God arose from nothing more than an infantile, his word, desire for an exalted father figure. I'm sure we've all heard this theory before. One that could always protect us, always love us, and whose cloak of mystery prevented us from ever becoming disillusioned as we do with our own very human parents. A documentary was recently recommended the other day called Born Again. And in it, the director, who's also the main subject of the film, says, "A child will do anything for the love of their mother and the approval of their father." She seems to agree with Freud's beliefs as she describes our very human desire, yearning to be seen, to be heard, to be understood, and most of all, most deeply human of all, to be loved for just who we are, warts and all. These needs and desires are a powerful driver for the creation of an eternal parental figure. Now, from a religious perspective, we can turn to Scripture first. According to Psalm 90, verse 2, God is God, from everlasting to everlasting. Other beings may exist eternally into the future, but only God can exist eternally in the past. Nothing came before him. He has no rivals. He says of himself, "I am the first and I am the last, and besides me there is no God." It's quite an eloquent bit of Scripture. And this appears to be a pretty clear answer to our question, but Upon closer reflection, the idea that there are no gods beside God is directly refuted throughout Scripture. The first commandment is, "Thou shalt have no other gods before me." If there were no other gods that existed, why would such a claim even be necessary? In Psalm 86:8 it reads, "There is none like you among the gods, O Lord." And we hear in Exodus how we should not worship other gods because the Lord, whose name is jealous, is a jealous God. And in Psalms and showcased in the book of Job, we hear about Yahweh being the God of the ocean. And this Yahweh beat out the other gods to become the most powerful one, thus becoming the one true God we hear of today. Now, this contradiction places doubt on the veracity of the notion that God is everlasting and eternally in the past. There's also a theory by classicist E.R. Dodds that religion and the rise of a monotheistic personal God derived from backlash against ancient Greeks' emphasis on rational inquiry. In other words, the idea being that faith, that which we can know by feeling, was directly counter to Greek philosophers' intense skepticism. It's the head and the heart debate that we hear so often. But one additional thought is that if Scripture opens up for God using the Greek word logos, which can be translated as word, thought, or speech, then perhaps God was spoken into creation. And then why is it not possible for God to have been both created and creator? As Unitarian Universalists, we have the freedom to draw from any of these sources to come to our own conclusions as to the origin of God. If we allow ourselves humility, we know there is much about this universe we do not yet know. Even ideas that once seemed fairly straightforward, like time, or the Big Bang, or dimensions, now seem more and more complex. To believe all of our questions about a higher power have thus far been answered would be pretty presumptuous. However, part of our journey as preachers is about trying to make sense of this world by asking the big questions so that we can come up with answers of our own. So now the onus is on you. What is your answer to this big question? Amen.